r/nosleep. Posted by you/drewtheunquestioned. The worst inmate at my prison is loose and I don't think he's human. I'm writing this while the prison I work at is in lockdown. One of our inmates has disappeared from his cell and we're searching the whole facility for him. Honestly, I hope we don't find him. I don't care if he got out, just so long as he isn't here anymore. I can't think of anyone who scared me as much as that guy did. He'd only been here a few months, yet everyone in this place is either terrified of him or wants him dead, and that includes us guards. I had been working for the Lakeland Correctional Facility for almost 2 years before they brought him in. We had a few infamous prisoners and more than a few I had to watch my back around, but overall it was pretty standard. We watch each other's backs and keep our head on a swivel around the animals. In those 2 years I only had a half-dozen incidents I was involved with, most of which were nothing more than domestic disputes and a few drug busts. Couple of times I had to put some mouthy con in his place. But when this guy came in from the city, he changed the place somehow. Guy had no name, no ID of any kind. A pure John Doe case, which is something that never happens anymore. He was doing life for killing a family in their home for seemingly no reason. Like these animals need a reason. But he wasn't on drugs, didn't have a weapon, didn't even speak English or any kind of language. It was like he dropped out of the sky from another world. He'd killed the family with his bare hands and teeth, looked like a rabid dog attack. Cops found him in a closet covered in blood and looking like a cornered animal. It took 4 deputies to bring him in. Obviously, no one here had any idea who he was or what to expect. There was talk about him, theories about who he was, where he came from, but it was all just casual banter, until he actually arrived. Even before you saw him, you felt something. Like a shadow when a cloud blocks the sun. A drop in temperature and a kind of heaviness that made you feel anxious for no real reason. Everybody felt it, even the other inmates. They briefed all the guards on him and gave us what little information they had on him. He wasn't even officially sentenced to serve his time at this prison. He was here temporarily for the foreseeable future until they could get him to talk or find out where the hell he came from. The warden decided to keep him in the psych ward until they could figure out how he would be around other inmates. I'll never forget the day he arrived. It was unbearably hot and muggy. The overcast sky made everything look gray and washed out. The bus he came in on stopped by the yard where all the inmates gathered to assess the new meat. The bus driver hurried off and quickly threw up around the front of the bus. He was white as a sheet and visibly shaking. I wasn't assigned to unload the new prisoners that day, but I watched as they were brought out one by one on a long chain. Normally when new prisoners arrive, the yard is like a school cafeteria, all chattering, laughing and shouting about the new guys. But that day it was quiet as a funeral. They all just watched with identical looks of unease. Even the few that joked around or tried to break the tension seemed only half-hearted. The prisoners at the front walked steady, looking over their shoulder nervously, their faces pale and sweaty. Right away you could tell where he was in the line because the guys in front of him moved quickly to get away and the guys behind him hung back. They kept him away just as far as the chain would allow, and seeing him, even from a distance, I could understand why. Now I've seen some pretty gnarly dudes come through here. Guys who were homeless when they got. They were hairy and smelly and left a brown stain on everything they so much as looked at. But this guy, he was something else. He was tall and thin, had to be 7 feet easy. He was so filthy and greasy I couldn't tell if he was black or white or what. Looked like his skin was just wet clay stuck on a skeleton, and if you touched him you'd leave finger-shaped holes in it and come away with crud stuck under your nails that would never wash off. His hair was long and stringy and hung over his face. It looked like the hair you'd pull out of a shower drain, wet with grease and God knows what. His face was like a skull dipped in black muck. He had lips, but they were so thin they never really closed. His teeth were the color of corn kernels sticking out of a green turd. If it weren't for his eyes I would have thought he was a corpse made into a puppet as a joke. His eyes were sunken but wide, looked like an infected boil with pupils black as corpse beetles. I've seen crazy before. I've seen guys who looked ready to bark and chew a guy's face off at any moment. This guy was impossible to read. Sometimes he seemed like a cringing coward who'd piss himself if you moved at him, other times he'd be vicious as an alpha mandrill. The worst thing about him was the smell though. God, you can't get away from it. As soon as it hits you, it stays with you for days like it's got a handful of your nose hairs and just hangs there for dear life. It was like a dead dog floating in a barrel of medical waste. You almost expected to see maggots squirming around in his hair. All that was bad enough, but what really got to me was how terrifying he was. Not because of anything he said or did, just looking at him or even being in the same room as him made you want to either turn tail and run or rush him head on and choke the life out of him. He had that effect on everyone. Buddies of mine that would stare down a stone-cold killer, they wouldn't go near him, and if we made them they promised to put him down like a rabid dog. Just seeing him look at you made you want to scream. I'd never met anyone who made people on edge by just existing like that. He was wrong. Everything about him was wrong. We all hated him, and even though we kept him separate from the inmates, they hated him too. That first night we put him in psych ward, we had to clear out all the other inmates because they looked ready to chew through the bars if we didn't get them away from him. Even the guards didn't want to go near him to check on him. They said he was screaming and banging around all night in there. After that we moved him into the protected custody wing with all the snitches and pedos. Let those scum deal with him. It wasn't long before we noticed the effect he was having on the inmates. They all looked worse than ever, mean-tempered, jumpy, ready to snap at anyone over anything. I'd never seen them like that. If things kept on that way we were gonna have a damn riot on our hands. I could tell the warden saw it too. He said the attorney that worked on his case had nothing else for us on him. Warden said he even suggested we just put him down and call it an accident. It's not like the guy had a family or anyone to care enough to sue or investigate. I think Warden was giving that idea serious thought until the rumors started. At first it was the pedos claiming they'd seen him in their cell after lights out, or that he'd been showing up in their dreams. I was ready to believe it was just because the guy was weird looking and smelled so bad it would drive anyone crazy. But the other COs who worked that block at night said they thought they saw him outside his cell. A couple of times they almost raised the alarm when they saw a shape duck into an empty room, but when they went in and turned on the light no one was there and the freak was still in his cell. They told me they never saw him on his bunk. He was always just standing at the back of the cell and watching them as they passed, standing there looking like Nosferatu if he had a serious drug problem and slept in a septic tank. What was strange was, some of the pedos that said they saw him in their cell said he would attack them. They'd start screaming and thrashing around, but when the CO showed up they were fighting with nothing. They were claiming it was nightmares until they noticed bite marks on the guys and scratches. Maybe they did it to themselves in their sleep, but I have never heard of anyone doing that to themselves, and anyways some of those bites and scratches they'd have to be a damn contortionist to pull off. It got so bad they were starting to injure themselves bad enough to be sent to medical. One of them even managed to kill himself, maybe on accident but who knows. Even the COs were refusing to go in that block after dark. Warden called a meeting and basically told us to lock that cell block and leave him to starve in there. Now for a straight-laced guy like that to tell us to basically murder a guy was unbelievable, and if you were to tell me that a month ago I'd have slapped you in the face on principle. But no one objected to the idea. We all knew that guy was bad for this place and the sooner he was dead the better. That was the plan until the bastard started talking. At first, some of COs swore they heard him repeat things they were saying, like he was listening to their conversations and will repeat a word here and there. Then one of them said they were walking past the cell block and they heard him repeating something over and over. They said it sounded like he was saying please don't hurt me and are you sure? In this deep, wet voice, like a garbage disposal trying to unclog itself. When he went in to see if it was him talking the guy clammed up and just stared at him, but he swears that creepy mother was grinning at him. Once he started talking, they had to call in the guy's attorney, which meant we had to make it look like we actually took care of the guy. After that he was a regular chatterbox, saying all kinds of random things in broken English to anyone within earshot. Couple guys tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't answer questions or say anything that made any kind of sense. When his attorney showed up he looked like he was about to go in for heart surgery. God help him, the law said we had to leave him alone in the room with the attorney. I didn't like the guy's odds. Most inmates wouldn't think of attacking their own attorney, the one person that's required to be on their side. But with this creep, you didn't know what he would do. They were in there for almost 3 hours before the attorney started screaming. Sounded like a little kid getting belted by his old man. I ran in there with a couple other guards and almost trampled the attorney who was crawling away with one hand over his face and a trail of blood dripping from between his fingers. I turned on the creep but he was just sitting in his chair at the table, so tall he looked like a grown-up sitting at a preschooler's desk. He was grinding like a skeleton, his lips looked gone, and his teeth were a blood orange color with flaps of skin stuck between them. Even with the adrenaline and in the heat of the moment, I couldn't bring myself to touch him. It was only when I saw 3 other guys surround him that I got the stones to grab him and pull him out of the room. The attorney lost his nose. Said the guy shot across the table so fast he didn't have time to react. Bit his nose right off and swallowed it right in front of him. That was the only thing he said about it that made any sense. I heard he'd committed himself since then. Said he was screaming before the guy went for his nose because of the terrible things he was seeing and feeling. Guy had a total breakdown. Didn't even realize his nose was gone. When I went to Warden to talk about it, He told me the attorney had left his notes and questions the guy had answered before everything went to hell. He couldn't look at them, legally, but he did anyway, and now he didn't know what to do with it. I managed to convince him to let me read it. If only he'd told me off and sent me home for even asking. God, what it said made sense and made no sense at the same time, if you can understand that. The questions the attorney asked were only half answered. Under the name question he only wrote empty, no name and missing, whatever that means. Under the question about where he was from, the answer he wrote was under blank, shadow-filled? Empty everywhere. The questions about if he understood what he was charged with and if he knew why he was arrested were both blank. The question about how he came to be here simply said, pain, hurt, bright, crushing, empty, trapped. The question about why he was here made the least sense. The answer he wrote was learning. Teach pain. Teach words. House school of suffer. Learn suffer. Learn live. Learn fun. The pages were stained with splotches of red and I had to put them down before I lost my lunch. That was when I and the other COs had had enough. We took that bastard into solitary confinement, to the worst cell we had, and we laid into him. We beat the piss out of him. At first the guy was shouting and begging like any other inmate we put the boots to. For a minute I thought we won. Then he just stopped reacting completely. He was grinning, if you can call it that. The blood coming out of this guy was like the blood of a corpse, thick and dark and smelling worse than anything. One of the guys had to quit because he couldn't stop throwing up. Now the guy was laughing, chuckling in a low gurgling cough. We just wanted to break him, to put him in his place, but something inside me wanted to kill him in that moment. Something primal and unconscious. Not anger, but fear. Pure animal terror. That scared me enough to make me pull back. After that we went back to keeping him locked in the pedo block and tried to forget he was there while hoping he would starve to death soon. This worked until the prisoners started telling us they saw him out and creeping around after lights out. We ignored them at first. Then it was getting to be every night. One or more would start screaming in their cell, saying he was in there with them, that he was in their dreams and was standing there when they woke up. None of the COs found him in any of the cells of course, and the inmates were looking worse and worse. A fight in the lunchroom almost caused a riot. Everyone looked like pals, pale faces, sunken crazy eyes. We had a lot of suicides piling up. That was when I noticed something strange. One night we forgot to cut the lights in the pedo block after dark. The lights were on all night. That night, we had no complaints from the inmates about the creep. I started leaving the lights on in the block at night and with that the complaints disappeared. The creep on the other hand, started making a terrible racket every night we left them on. So much so, the guards were getting fed up and the inmates close enough to hear were starting to lose it. It all came to a head when the leaders of 3 of the biggest gangs in the prison approached the COs and gave them an ultimatum. They let them into the pedo block to take that weird bastard out once and for all, or they would tear this place apart until they could do it themselves. I wanted to shout out hallelujah and shake their hands, but we had to stay cool. I could see the relief in the other guys too. We set it up for them to go to his cell just after lights out. We had the system checked and the lights scheduled for a test to hide us moving them. Anything else could be attributed to camera malfunction due to the electrical issues. We sent them in there and waited at the front of the block. These guys were the scariest inmates we had, at least before the creep showed up. Sanchez was a short Mexican covered in tattoos and built like an MMA fighter. He was a hitman for MS-13 known for preferring to use a machete on his targets. Lincoln was almost as tall as the creep and wide as a Buick. He looked like an NFL linebacker with a steroid problem. Haas was almost as big as Lincoln but looked more like a long-distance runner. He was white supremacist who liked to set black-owned churches on fire and wait outside with a Louisville slugger to bash in the heads of the fleeing congregants as they ran out. Just seeing them all together in the same room as you made you nervous. These guys were the apex predators of the LCF. When I heard the creep start screaming I couldn't help but smile and the other guards were laughing and patting each other on the back. That is until the screams started to sound like laughter. Our faces fell and we stared down the block at the cell, waiting for something to happen. That was when the lights went out and the laughter stopped. I shouted something about whoever shut the lights off to put them back on, but none of the others had touched the switch. It must have been the fish heads in maintenance shutting down random blocks for a cover story. I thought maybe it was fine until the screaming started. A scream so high and shrill and made the metal vibrate around us rang out of the darkness. Then a chorus of screams, sobs, and shouts poured out of that cell block like the gates of hell had opened. Someone shouted for the lights, but I only heard them faintly over the sounds coming from the dark. Christ, it was the worst thing I'd ever heard. Worse than the sounds of new guys being broken in on their first night on the block. I didn't know people could make those sounds, especially not those 3. Someone had to go in there but no one stepped up. The noise brought other guards and when the lights came back on we formed a line and went in with our riot gear, ready for the worst. Or so we thought. God, the ugliness of that scene cannot possibly be described. The room looked like it had been freshly painted red. Sanchez was on his knees, digging organs out of his own torso like a farmer cleaning a pig for slaughter. His face was gone and what was left of it was stuffed in his mouth like a sock. Lincoln was naked, his groin looked like an M80 went off in his pants and he was slamming his bloody forehead into the cement wall so hard I could see brains starting to leak out of his ears. The only thing we found of Haas was his scalp and 8 of his fingers. The creep was gone. We've been in lockdown ever since. It's been 5 days now and we haven't been able to leave. The inmates have been screaming for help and saying the creep has been picking them off one by one, driving them crazy. A lot of them have killed themselves. I'd feel bad if I didn't think it was keeping the creep from coming after us. I made sure the lights in here are all the time. I don't know if keeps him away. I don't know what the hell he is. Somehow he can move around the prison freely. Past locked doors and walls. I think it has something to do with the dark but I don't know. We've got our riot gear and some rifles. The warden is trying to organize us to sweep the prison and find the creep. If we can't find him or kill him, we'll have to call the cops in for backup. I hope we don't find him. I hope he's gone and God help whatever town he shows up in. I found something online that might explain where the hell he came from. Some guy in the city said he killed a bunch of kids there. Here is the link. It's been 3 days now. The state police have been making sweeps every hour of the whole facility but they only find dead bodies. At least with them around I don't have to be there. Most of the guards have taken time off until this clears up. I try to call in to see how things are going there at least a couple times a day. They've started putting the prisoners on buses and shipping them to other prisons in the state. They might even transfer the COs to different facilities too. Guess that means I'll be moving soon, which is going to mess up things with my ex and my kid. Could be worse. I don't know what's going to happen when the whole place is empty. I heard some of the bigger acronyms have been swarming the place. Maybe they know about what the hell that thing is. Maybe they can even kill it. If it's even there anymore. Lately I'll catch a whiff of that terrible smell. Just for a moment. Maybe it's just the memory or PTSD. All I know is I sleep with the lights on full blast and I keep my Glock loaded and ready. I just hope the issues I've been having with the power lately don't get worse. I think if everything went dark on me at once I'd just drop dead, or they'd find me screaming and foaming at the mouth, hopelessly insane. I guess it'll all be over in any case. Wish me luck. Posted by you/drewtheunquestioned. I helped a homeless man who told me he was running from something that steals people's skin. I was driving my girlfriend home after she got off work one night and I noticed a man standing under a street lamp on the corner. She saw him too and we talked about why he was there. Maybe he needed help. We both agreed I should at least check on him so she got out and gave me a kiss, telling me to be safe before heading up to her apartment. I watched him for a minute. He was looking around quickly, like maybe he thought someone was after him. I felt my gut barking at me to leave him be. He might be crazy or on drugs, he could steal the car or my wallet. For a brief moment we locked eyes and I saw genuine fear and that made my gut quiet down and my courage rise. I drove over to where he sat and pulled up to the light, rolling down the passenger side window to talk with him. He didn't get up right away, he just looked around for anyone else and gave me a suspicious look. "You doing all right, man?" I said, trying to be as friendly as I could. He ignored me until I heard a dog bark somewhere nearby and that made him jump like something had poked him between the shoulders. The dog barked a few times more and I could see the man was in terror. "You want a ride somewhere?" I asked, trying to calm him down. He got up and came to the door without taking his eyes off where the dog had barked. As he got in I looked him over. His arms were filthy but no track marks, his face was haggard and his eyes bloodshot but I didn't smell alcohol on his breath. He was wearing slacks that were worn down at the knees and a crusty gray snow jacket with fur around the hood that had turned to a matted mess the color of a coyote pelt from years of dirt and grime. He wasn't wearing a shirt under it and his skin was hard and dry like leather and stretched tight over his ribs. No prison tattoos. He looked a bit more relaxed once he was in the car and asked with a voice like sandpaper on leather. "Can you take me to the bus station, sir?" I looked at him harshly and said, "Look man, I'll take you wherever you need to go. But you have to tell me if you have any weapons on you and if you do, you put them out the window. Understand? The same for any drugs." The man nodded and held out his hands. "I got no weapons and never had no drugs, sir." I looked for any signs of a lie in his eyes but saw none. As we drove he began to tell me where he was going. He came from further south, almost 2 states away. Name's Walker. Been doing just that for going on 26 years now. Been all over. Seen some things that'd make you swear off sleep for the rest of your days. Being on the streets is like buying a ghost. Some notice you, some are scared of you. But most just ignore you. You become invisible. Living that way will drive anyone crazy after a while because you see people do stuff they'd never do if someone was looking. Funny things sometimes, but mostly bad things. Things that will turn your heart black and poisonous if you let it. He looked out the window. I could only imagine the memories that brought up for him. He talked easily for a man who lived on the streets. There was a fearless resignation to him and it made me uneasy. As we drove toward the station I asked him why he came here and where he was heading. He took a deep breath and thought for a moment. I had to get away from something bad, down south. No gangs or cops or nothing, just. He looked out at the streets, trying to find the words. I had come in off a boxcar near the border of Mexico. Was traveling with a couple of roadies I'd met further west. We went into the town and talked with some of the locals and they pointed us toward a camp nearby the train yard where we could stay. It was a shanty town under a rail bridge about a 40-minute walk from downtown. There was a half-dozen guys there and they seemed okay. We found a spot and set up our camp and found out the good spots for food and supplies from the locals. Everything seemed normal until it got dark. There was a communal fire pit at the center of this place. They told us it had to burn all night, that because we knew we would have to tend the fire for a few nights. When I tried asking about it they'd beat around the bush or just stop talking altogether. It was Big Bear that noticed the factory a ways outside of camp. Big Bear was one of the guys traveling with me. The man was a mountain of hair and filth but he was the nicest person you could ever meet. He had a laugh that made you want to laugh just by hearing it. Bear brought up the factory to one of the locals and they acted like he'd called the devil by name. We had pulled up to a red light and he stopped a moment looking out at an all-night diner with a kind of hesitant expression. I could see he was hungry and I wanted to hear what happened to him so I suggested we stop in for some coffee and a bite to eat before moving on. He looked at me and gave me a sad smile before agreeing with a bashful thanks. After we ordered and got our coffees, he told me about the factory and what supposedly lived there. I seen the place coming in. Looked like a packing plant gone out of business long before I was born. So old, there weren't no roads led into it, at least none you could see. Never woulda know it was there unless you were to walk up on it. From a distance it didn't look like anything but an old building. It was when you got close you started to notice things weren't right. No one in the camp would talk about it. All they said was something bad lived in there and it was a bad idea to talk about it, or even think about it. Now, you come across a lot of superstitions out on the road. The life on the streets is a world of talismans, taboos, and good luck charms. Stuff you never say out loud or something you carry with you or bury near your camp to keep bad luck away. When you have no control of your world and the terrible things it can do to you, you find ways of controlling it, even if it's bullshit. I reckon people been doing that longer than we've been writing or talking. But this kind of fear, this kind of taboo, was something I'd never seen before. They lived in terror of this place, but they found they could stay out of harm's way by ignoring it. That and keeping the fire going at night. That first night the three of us took shifts keeping the fire going. I took the first shift, then Glenn took his. Finally Bear had the last shift before sunrise. The next morning I could tell something was bothering him so I asked him if something happened. He said he heard sounds coming from that factory. Said there was like animal sounds but like if a man were imitating them. Couple of times he said it sounded like it was laughing or maybe screaming, he didn't know. He just knew he didn't like it. We rotated the times between us for a few weeks and it was always the last watch when you'd hear something out there. The sounds reminded me of a lunatic screaming in th night. Lots of folks on the street aren't right in the head and I've been woken up by one screaming his head off or babbling in the middle of the night. That's what the sounds were like. One time I thought I'd seen eyes shine like an animal in the dark. Sometimes there would be a terrible smell that would drift through. A god-awful smell, and let me tell you, I've been around rot, shit, and garbage but this was like nothing else. It made you feel smaller, like you was trying to retreat back into yourself to get away from it. It was a wrong smell. That's the closest I ever came to describing it. He shuddered slightly and held his coffee up, taking a sniff as if to chase the memory of that smell away. He shook his head and looked down as he spoke. Glenn took off after a week. Couldn't handle the weirdness. Bear and I stuck around for some damn fool reason. I can't recall what it was, honestly, but we stayed. It was a little while later Bear started acting funny. He was keeping to himself more and he looked worn, like he might be sick or couldn't sleep. When I asked him what was wrong, he said he seen something a few nights back. He seen what lived in that factory, and he said it seen him too. He'd been hearing sounds like always, but then he heard something closer, a dragging sound. He had to leave the fire alight and let his eyes adjust to see it out there in the moonlight, but he seen it. He said it looked like a pile of rags wearing an old oily black wig. There was little glints of white hanging off it, and he swore they was bones, small and large. It was dragging a sack behind it, and out the back through a hole, a white hand, pure as pearl in the moonlight, was dragging on the ground from inside. That was when the thing looked right at him. Its eyes caught the firelight like an animal and glowed like embers. He felt all the strength run out of him and fell to the ground. He was trying to crawl back to the fire, but it was like he'd been drained. The thing let out a laugh like a coyote calling that got him moving again, and he made it back to the fire. He said since then he hadn't slept, except a bit during the day. He would hear it sometimes, little yips and barks. The smell seemed to follow him everywhere, and he lost all appetite because of it. Every day he looked worse. I covered his spot tending the fire at night, but still he would wake up screaming in his bag if he'd managed to sleep at all. Then one day he was gone. He took a sip of coffee with a shaky hand and shook his head. The guy at the fire said they seen him get up and walk out into the dark. No light, no expression, not a word to any of them. Just walked off in the direction of the factory. There weren't no noises that night, or any of the next nights. I tried to get some of the others to help he look for Bear in that old factory, but none of them would. Can't blame em, really. Can't believe I went myself, but I did. Bear was one of the only decent folks I'd come across out there, and I felt I owed it to him. So off I went. During daylight, of course. God himself couldn't make me go there at night. Other than what put me there in the first place, that was the worst mistake of my life. The building was only half standing. It looked like a Hollywood set, the framework and outer walls giving the illusion of a building with nothing inside. There were little windows at the base that must have led to a basement, and I could see a clear path to and from one of the larger broken panes that must have been where whatever lived there came and went. I looked down into it, but the darkness was as solid as cloth inside, and I went to the front entrance instead. The doors were rusted off the hinges, and a solid metal chain held them to the center frame where they hung like angel wings. Inside was bright and open, the roof having decayed and crumbled over the years. They were huge rusting hunks of machinery and old meat hooks on long resting poles. The stench of the place was overpowering. It was that same wrong smell I'd catch now and then at night, only this was like standing at the source. I had to hold my shirt over my mouth to go any further. That was when I noticed it. It was dead quiet. There wasn't a single bug chirping or bird calling. Even the wind had stopped. The only sound was a dull buzzing, like an unseen swarm of flies. As I noticed this, I realized I was standing before an open cellar door. The corroded stairs went down into that eerily solid darkness, and all I could see at the bottom was a mass of some god-awful sludge and standing stagnant water, orange with rot and rust. There were bright white bones jutting out of it and clumps of old sun-bleached fur. Even more confusing, there were scattered around it several white sausage shapes, some floating in the slime and others down at the bottom. I only saw what might have been animal teeth somewhere in the sludge before the smell became so overwhelming I turned and ran, but not before hearing what sounded like clattering bones and someone clicking their teeth together down there. As I ran, my mind was finally able to process that the sausages scattered around down there hadn't been sausages at all. They were fingers. He swallowed hard and looked like he might faint. I called the waitress over for more coffee, looking around the diner to give my mind a break. This was not how I thought this night would go. I thought I'd be doing a man a favor and scoring a few points of karma for myself, maybe get an interesting story to tell later. But this was different. His story was of course utterly mad, and yet there was no sign of illness or fraud in the old man. I couldn't make sense of it, so I resigned to keep listening. I did end up seeing Big Bear one last time, in a way. I was tending the fire one night and I heard him call out to me from the dark. I was surprised as hell to hear his voice again. It sounded just like him. I couldn't see hardly nothing out there, but once my eyes adjusted I seen him. He looked like he was hunched over, just beyond the firelight. Wearing the same clothes he wore all the time, only they was stained black with something, like he'd been rolling in old motor oil. His face was oddly slack, like he'd been shot with a muscle relaxer. It was his eyes that made me see it weren't him. They were just dark holes, like little caves, and somewhere deep inside something caught the firelight and glimmered. I just turned away from him and stared at the fire, ignoring anything I heard from the dark, forcing the fear away by focusing on the fire until morning came. That was when things got worse. That terrible smell followed me everywhere. I couldn't sleep, couldn't think. I started hearing voices. Sometimes it would sound like Bear, or Glenn. Other times it sounded like my wife. I hadn't even thought of her in so long. Hearing her voice come out of the dark like that scared me worse than anything. He gripped the coffee mug tightly and looked away with painful embarrassment. That was a long time ago now. I ain't told that story to anyone, but I might as well tell you, things being as they are. He looked at his hands like a man condemned. I left because I killed my little girl. She was only 2 months. His voice broke as he said it and I could see his eyes gloss over. Had a house and a wife then. Good wife. God, I miss her. She was an angel. She had a fever, real bad, couldn't stay out of bed longer than a few minutes. How she took care of our little girl before I'd gotten home from work I'll never know. It was up to me to watch over her and the little one that night. I fed her, changed her, put her to bed, everything I was supposed to. Once she were asleep I thought I could relax a little. Got me a couple beers and settled down to watch TV for a bit. Just a normal night. He shook his head as though he were trying to shoo away a fly that was bothering him. Well, maybe I had one too many, or maybe I was just dead tired from the day, or maybe I was just a water-headed fool with 2 left hands and no right to the life I had. My girl, my baby girl, she woke up crying and I went to her. Everything was a blur for me, the house felt like we was on a ship in rough seas. I tried to help her, to hold her, but she fell. His voice broke again and he took a couple hard breaths to steady himself. I dropped her. I dropped my baby girl and she hit the floor. God, that sound. He sniffed and tensed as though he were pulling a long splinter. She weren't breathing, she weren't crying no more. I knew she was dead. I held her in my arms and I said I was sorry over and over. I thought about my wife, how she would hate me for what I'd done, how she would scream and cry and curse me until the day I died. I went into full panic. I picked up my little girl and I wrapped her and put her back in the crib. I didn't even take anything, I just ran. I ran until my legs gave out and I collapsed in an alley and screamed myself hoarse. He didn't look at me as he finished his story, he just looked out at the dark streets. Been out here ever since. His voice was steady again. Thought about dying every day but I ain't earned that. I've been through the ringer. Been beaten, stabbed, raped, starved, sick with anything and everything and still I ain't suffered enough for what I done. And now. He trailed off. Wow. That was all I could think to say. He seemed to be thinking hard about something. I'm sorry to ask but. He shook his head as if he decided something. I didn't come here to catch a bus, you see. This town is where I used to live, before all this. I came to see her one last time. To tell her I'm sorry and get some closure, you know? Hell, she may not even live here anymore, but if you could take me there so I could try, well, I'd appreciate it. He looked at me, his eyes still glossy and I agreed. We agreed to go after he finished his story and a few more coffees. The dreams that came when I managed to sleep at all. They were the worst. I was always back in that factory, looking down into that hole, seeing those fingers scattered around the filth and then a scream would wake me up only it was me screaming myself awake. I had to get away from that camp so I went into town and found a shelter that would have me. Not all shelters are bad, but I'd learned to steer clear of them over the years. You risk getting robbed or worse when you're in a place regular people expect you to be. Better to find your own space away from anyone. But right then I needed to be around regular people. I needed a building with doors and locks. That first night they almost threw me out when I woke up screaming. The next night I woke up with the night guard yelling in my face as I was trying to go out the locked front doors. I tried not to sleep and every night the sounds from the factory would ring out in the distance, getting closer it seemed. If anyone else noticed they wouldn't say anything. I wanted them to put me in a locked room or tie me to the bed but they just thought I was crazy and offered me rehab or a church. One night I came out of a dream and I was standing in a dark field. I didn't know where I was or how I'd got there. Then I heard the howls and I could see the shape of that factory in the moonlight. Christ, I had almost walked right into it. I turned and ran back to town, completely shaken. What made me leave that place and come back here after all this time was a dream. I don't even remember falling asleep, I was just standing in the dark of the shelter, looking up at the moon. It looked like the roof of the place got torn off. The place was empty, all the cots full of snoring shapes were gone. All I could see in the blue light of the moon was big shapes of machines. That was when I realized where I was and I turned around to see the opening to the cellar behind me, like an open mouth pouring out rotten breath. He wiped sweat from his brow, his face had gone a sickly green as he remembered. It was quiet as the grave, just like before, only now there was clattering like bones being dropped or kicked around on concrete coming from that hole. There was a wet slapping sound like meat being tossed and dragged. And beneath all that, what I heard coming from that hole was a low muttered whisper, unintelligible and constant. I felt like I wasn't in my body no more. I saw myself standing at the mouth of that hole, and I saw myself take a step toward it. Everything in me screamed to stop, but I kept walking. The terror was a dull roar that overpowered everything except that low whisper. That's when I heard something I can't believe, even now. He took a heavy shuddering breath. I heard a baby crying. My little girl. I knowed it was her. I'll never forget that sound, and the devil take me if I ever do. I heard my little girl, and it shook me out of my dream or trance or whatever had me. Only I didn't wake up in the shelter. I came back to myself, but I was still there, in that place, in the dark. I don't have any idea how I got to be there, but the realization almost gave me a heart attack from pure terror. I turned away from that black open mouth and ran. I ran through the dark brush and along the train tracks harder than I ever ran before. And all the time I can hear it barking and laughing behind me. Sometimes so close I can almost feel the heat of its breath on my neck. I jumped a train, damn near killed myself doing it, and left. He finished his coffee and seemed to collect himself. At first I just wanted to get as far away as possible, but after hearing my little girl again, even if it were just a dream, I wanted to come back here. Maybe being so close to something so evil made me feel like I had suffered enough, or maybe getting away from it was a sign I was ready. Maybe after facing something like that, facing my past wasn't so bad. He shook his head like he still couldn't figure out how he came to that decision. After we finished our coffees and he had finished his story, it was getting close to 3 a.m. He looked outside at the dark streets, and for a moment a look of pure panic flashed across his face. I spun around to look in the direction he was looking, and I saw a dark shape slip out of view in an alleyway. I only saw it for a moment, but I could have sworn I'd seen eyes shine like a cat's eyes from within the dark mass. Walker was breathing hard, and I could see tears streaming down his cheeks. "What was that?" I said to no one in particular. After hearing his story, my mind conjured all manner of nightmarish fantasies, but nothing approaching logic. I tried to comfort him, but he was shaking his head in his hands, muttering under his breath. After a minute he started to calm down and looked at me as though he'd forgotten I was there. "Thank you, for everything, sir. I really appreciate you listening and buying me that meal and all. I think I'll just stay here till morning and head out. Might even get myself a haircut and a thrift store suit." I asked if he wanted me to stay and give him a ride somewhere, but he waved me off. "You done plenty for me, son. I know my way around this town. I'll find out if my wife still lives around here, and even if she don't, I think I'll stick around a while, maybe try to salvage something from the wreck of my life. Fresh start and all that." I could see he wasn't lying, but I also knew he didn't think he'd be doing any of that anytime soon. He looked damned. I gave him what cash I had and made sure he was okay before I left. He tried to smile and look hopeful, but his eyes told me different. I had to leave him there was nothing else I could do. I didn't see him again for a few weeks after that night. I hoped he had found his wife and was able to get some sort of closure, but after seeing him again I don't think that would be possible. I caught a glimpse of him under a street light one night, just standing and staring up at my window. He looked disheveled and slack somehow, like he'd lost 40 pounds and was just floating in his clothes. His eyes were just empty dark holes, and I could have sworn I saw a glimmer of something deep inside them. Lately I've noticed a lot of lost pet signs all over the neighborhood. It seems like every power pole and street sign has at least 2 signs asking about a missing dog or cat. Maybe there are coyotes around here. I could have sworn I heard them howling close by one night. Maybe they killed something nearby. That would explain the terrible smell around here lately. I should warn my girlfriend about them. She's been trying to scare me lately by hiding outside the house at night and calling my name. Maybe I'll go out and surprise her one night, see how she likes it. Posted by you/drewtheunquestioned. My brother didn't kill those kids, something that lived in his closet did. My brother and I are 10 years apart. Our parents were normal on the outside. My mother was a lawyer and my stepfather was a high school teacher, but at home, behind closed doors, they were monsters. I had been beaten, screamed at, had food taken away, forced to clean the house and work in the yard for hours. One time my stepdad choked me until I passed out. More than anything, it was made clear to me every day that I wasn't good enough and never would be. My brother was treated better, but seeing him go through even a fraction of what I went through was worse than anything they ever did to me. I was more like a father to him than a brother, and he was the reason I stayed around as long as I did. But living with my parents was unbearable, and I moved out as soon as I had the means. I was so caught up in my own life I didn't see what they were doing to him. I'm so sorry, Daniel. Daniel was always a shy kid. He was scared of the dark and spent many nights sneaking into my room to hide from the boogeyman in his closet. I noticed he was really concerned about that. More so than most kids. He believed it was real, that it lived in his closet and came out to give him nightmares. He was always safe in my room, but my parents never let him sleep there. He had to stay in his own room no matter how much he screamed and cried. I tried to talk to him about it. I told him the boogeyman wasn't real, that he couldn't hurt him. I was the one that got him a nightlight to help and made sure his closet was closed every night. I knew that they would hurt him if he cried too much, so I did everything I could to help him stay calm. He was 8 when I had to move out, and I thought seriously about just taking him and running, but I knew I would end up in jail and he would go right back to them. They said they were going to take him to a psychologist to help with his anxiety. If it was anything like how they treated me, they would be dumping pills down his throat until he couldn't think about how badly they were treating him. Like I said, I wasn't there when most of what happened with the other kids went down. It was when I had come over to hang out with him that he showed me his drawings of the boogeyman and all of the journals he'd written about it and the lengths he'd gone to protect himself. He told me Mom would take away his nightlight if he did something wrong, so he had to keep a flashlight next to his bed. They would take them whenever they found them, so he had several stashed throughout his room. I could tell things were getting worse for him, but there wasn't anything I could do except help him and reassure him the boogeyman wasn't real. Then I would go home and punch my dresser until my hands looked like hamburger meat and I couldn't breathe. Every time I went back, he had gotten worse. My stepdad took the door off his closet because he had been failing in school, so now Daniel had started drinking energy drinks to stay awake at night so he could sleep at school. One time he showed me the shoebox he had been collecting his pills in after pretending to take them. That scared me bad. All he had to do was eat a handful of those and, well, I couldn't even think about it. I took his box and told him to just flush them instead of keeping them, like I used to do. When he told me about the group sessions he'd been going to with other kids who believed in the boogeyman, it was the happiest I'd seen him in a while. I thought he might get better, and for a while he did. But then one of the kids in the group was found dead in his closet. They called off the group sessions, but it was too late. All of the kids who were in the group started to get worse. Daniel was convinced he had pissed it off somehow, that it was killing them because they knew too much about it. He wouldn't even talk to me anymore. I tried to find out what happened to the kid, but the cops said it was an accident, that he'd had some kind of freak heart attack and died. When I asked why they found him in the closet, they didn't care, it was just where he ended up. When the second kid was found dead, I started to think it might really be someone or something killing these kids. I started to have these nightmares. I'd wake up and see someone in my room, only they were gone when I tried to look at them or turn on the light. I started feeling like I was being watched everywhere I went. Every open door was like a black eye watching me. Once the third kid was found, the cops finally started to look into it as more than a coincidence, and that's when they first connected it to my brother. At first they tried to say it was his fault, the group sessions made things worse, like he had infected them with something. It didn't help that my brother had become a nervous wreck, refusing to go to school or sleep anywhere that wasn't fully lit. I offered to let him stay with me, but of course my mom wouldn't allow that. Can't let him get too far away from her control. He might realize what a terrible person she is. It was after a fourth kid turned up dead that my brother finally snapped. He told me he was just trying to get something to eat, just trying to mind his own business, but Mom was screaming at him about something. Just screaming in his face about what a stupid bastard he was, about how he's driving them all crazy. He said he remembers everything going black, and then he was standing over Mom and she was crying, begging him to stop. He just sat in a kind of stupor as the cops came and took him to jail. I went to see him and I tried to pay his bail, but I didn't make much money, so I just gave him what I could and tried to be there for him. Because he was only 13, he wasn't charged with anything serious and they took him home a few days later. After that, he locked himself in his room and refused to let anyone in. My parents treated him like a stranger and didn't even bother trying to help him. They told me a few days after that they planned to move out of state. When I asked if I could come see Daniel, they seemed to dodge the question. I thought he was gone, that they had taken him away from the only person who wanted to help him. It was a week later when he came to my door, crying and desperate. He looked like he hadn't slept in a long time, his eyes were sunken and dark and he was shaking so bad he couldn't speak. I helped him calm down enough to tell me what had happened. He said he had locked himself in his room after he attacked Mom and didn't realize they had left until he came out and saw all their stuff was gone. They had left him there. I couldn't believe it. I had never hated anything so much before. I thought it might poison me or stop my heart. I just held him and said I was sorry over and over. I asked him why he didn't come here right away and he seemed to retreat back into himself. He told me what it was like there, being alone in that house. The electricity only worked for the first few days, but after that he had to use flashlights to keep the thing away. He told me how it crashed around the house at night, making strange noises and even trying to get him to come out by sounding like mom or dad. He would go out through the window during the day and steal food and batteries from the 7-Eleven on the corner. He had convinced himself the boogeyman was killing them one by one until only one of them was left to believe in him. He needed to make sure he was the one left, so he did something terrible to make sure it happened. I didn't want to believe him, I wanted this to be a delusion. I couldn't process what he was telling me. He said it got so bad one night he had to run. He ran from street light to street light, staying away from the dark, and the whole time he could hear it following him, laughing at him. He only knew where one of the other kids lived and he got in through the kid's window. He said the kid was younger than him and he was crying. He tried to explain that the boogeyman was coming for him and that he had to do this so that it would stop, and he killed him. He said everything went black again, and after he was sitting on the kid's chest with his hands on his throat. He said he saw the light go out of the kid's eyes and he knew he had killed him. When he heard the parents coming he ran, and now he was here and he didn't know what to do. I just sat with him until morning, my brain had shut down. I couldn't believe it. I had to know if it was true. I left Daniel at my place and went to where he said the kid lived. They were wheeling him out in a body bag when I got there. A detective there saw me and started asking me why I was there and what I knew. I couldn't betray my brother, but what he did was unforgivable. He was a killer now. I told the detective my brother was really messed up and needed help, and I wouldn't tell him where he was unless he promised my brother would get the help he needed. They arrested my brother after that. I stayed with him as much as I could, but they were questioning him for hours. When I saw the detective again I wanted to know what was going to happen to my brother. He looked at me like a doctor with bad news and said Daniel was in a lot of trouble. If I wanted to help him, I had to tell them everything I knew about my brother, my parents, and his condition. I told them about my parents abandoning him at their house, that he was desperate and delusional and that he just needed mental help. The detective seemed to understand and said he would go to the house to verify my story. He also told me he would put a warrant out for my parents to answer for what they had done. I spent the night in the precinct, sleeping on a bench outside the holding cells. I woke up to hear Daniel screaming and saw that the lights for the holding cell had been turned off. The door was locked and no one was around to open it. I was kicking the door as hard as I could, listening to Daniel screaming just on the other side. I'll never be able to forget that sound. A few cops rounded the corner and tackled me to the ground. I was screaming for them to help my brother, and one of them heard the cries from inside and fumbled with the keys. Inside the cell block it was pitch black. The cops were all stunned by this, none of the lights worked. I managed to break away from the cop holding me and ran in to find him. Beyond the bars of the cell it was just a wall of black, like a velvet curtain. Daniel wasn't screaming anymore. One of the officers pulled out a flashlight, and as he turned to beam to look in the cell I saw it. It was just a flash, but it was there. Its eyes flashed like an animal when the light hits it. It was tall and thin like a scarecrow, its body a dark coat. I only saw its face for an instant, but it would forever be burned into my mind. Its skin was a rotten blackish blue and it was gaunt and tight against its skull. It had no lips, exposing its yellowed and crooked teeth, far more than any person should have. It had stringy, matted dark hair all around its head and down to its shoulders, like black straw. Its fingers stuck out from the sleeves of its jacket like dark fleshy crab legs, far too long to be human. It vanished as the light passed over it, and I desperately asked if any of them saw it. They only saw what had been crammed beneath the bunk in the cell. It was Daniel. His face was frozen in a look of absolute terror, and he had pulled his knees back into his chest so hard I could see his fingernails had been pried up like trapdoors. Everything went black and I woke up in the detective's office sometime later. He told me Daniel was dead, died of the same heart arrhythmia the others had died of. It was being ruled as a suicide and they would be pinning all the deaths on my brother so they could close the case. I was unable to process anything anymore. I did manage to ask why the lights went out in the holding cells, and the detective said it was a tripped breaker. Just a coincidence. Right. I could only walk in silence as they escorted me out. I didn't go home. I couldn't even remember where it was. I was so messed up. I know what I saw. I know my brother is innocent. I just don't know what to do. Maybe someone here can help me. Update. I found out my parents were being let go. They claimed Daniel had become threatening and refused to leave, so they had to abandon him. I wanted to scream when I found out. Mom could talk her way out of anything. I should have known. I'll bet they even helped them pin all the deaths on Daniel. I didn't think I could hate them more than I already did until that moment. The nightmares have been getting worse. One of the other kids was found dead, but they just filed it as an accidental death. They don't care that my brother was innocent. I think he was right, there is something killing them, something in the shadows. I don't know what it is, but I know what I saw. I can hear it sometimes, outside the door of my room. I sometimes think I hear Daniel calling out for me, but I know it's not him. I don't want to sleep anymore. Is this how Daniel was living all this time? I have to do something. I'm done with this spooky, haunted house bullshit. I think I know what to do. I have to go back to the house, to Daniel's room. Where this all started. I have to know. Update. I didn't know what to believe before now. I could have believed Daniel was crazy, that maybe I was crazy too. But now. I went to the house and I brought supplies. Extension cords, lamps, spotlights, and a gun. I found an outlet on the outside of a neighbor's house and ran the extension cords into the broken window of my brother's old room. I set up all the lights around a chair pointed at the closet and had them all rigged to a switch I held in one hand and the gun was in the other. Then I waited. I ate protein bars and brought some bottled water and I waited. The house smelled like a sewage dump. The walls of Daniel's room were filthy and messages were scrawled on it about the Shadow Man. I had a lot of time to think, about Daniel, about my parents, and about what I had seen that night in the holding cell. It had started to rain on the second evening and by nightfall it was storming. This had to be it. It couldn't be a better setting for this. I wanted it to end. The rain was coming in through the broken window and a mildew smell started to spread from it. Then another smell began to creep in, a worse smell. It was rotten but it burned like a chemical smell. It made me think of dead bodies dissolving in lye pits. I could feel it then. The air seemed to thicken and it got darker like I was slowly closing my eyes. I could feel my heart thudding painfully against my chest and all I could hear was the pumping of blood in my ears. I was panicking. I was messing it up. The fear seemed to unlock a memory I had repressed until then. I suddenly remembered where I had seen that face before. When I was 5 and Mom would take me to her law school so she could study, she let me roam around the campus as long as I promised to be back by a certain time. One of the times I went outside the law building and noticed a funny-looking tent. It looked like it was made of trash and I thought some kids might have built a fort. When I looked inside it was like an oven and a terrible smell rushed out of it. Inside I saw garbage and stuff piled up everywhere and in the middle was a large pile covered in blankets. At first I thought it was a scarecrow, it looked dried out and skeletal. It was a man. He sat against the back of the tent not moving. I thought he was smiling but it was just his teeth showing because his lips were gone. I saw his eyes move but they didn't look at me. Then I noticed the whites of his eyes were wriggling and what looked like white tears dropped down into his black beard. The tears were squirming back up his face when I realized they weren't tears, those weren't eyes, and this man was dead. I ended up running back inside and just waiting for Mom to come back. I didn't tell anyone what I saw and I had forgotten it until now. Until I saw it that night in Daniel's cell. The warm air hit my face like someone had opened an oven door and the smell seemed to stick to my skin like a mist. It started to step out of the closet now. It was tall, it had to stoop to step through the door. It was too dark to see anything except those crooked pus-colored teeth and the shine of its eyes deep in its skull. My chest felt too tight to breathe and I lost feeling in my hands. I tried to remember the plan and hit the switch. I felt it click and nothing happened. I almost passed out when I heard it and no lights came on. Someone must have noticed it and unplugged it, or maybe the storm had knocked out the power, or maybe this thing had cut the cord. I knew it was over. I raised the gun and put it to my head. The metal was cold on my temple and my hand was too numb to feel the trigger. Then the power came back on. The light blinded me for a moment and a terrible screech shook the windows of the house. I could see it now, it was a real physical being. Its hair was greasy and hung down over its face. It wore a long coat like a black duster and its skin was a bruised black color. It screamed and writhed in the light. It looked confused, and scared. That snapped me out of my trance and I pointed the gun at it. It looked at me with wild animal eyes, its grinning skull mouth opening to scream as I pulled the trigger and saw the bullet tear through its midsection. It reeled back and dove through the window, bellowing like a wounded bear before disappearing into the dark crane. I felt like I couldn't move. I just sat there for what felt like days until I saw the sun rising over the trees. It was real. It was a real creature. I saw it, smelled it, felt it, and I shot it. The wall next to the window was spattered with blood the color of blackberry juice. I went home and slept. I didn't even let go of the gun the whole time. I don't know what to do now. It might still be out there. Maybe it died. Can it die? I haven't had any nightmares since then and things seem to be normal again. I don't know what I did that night. I don't know if it will come back for me. I can't do anything but keep living. Keep pretending the world makes sense and monsters aren't real. There is nothing else to do. I'll update if anything else happens. Update. I've been seeing a psychiatrist about my anxiety. He told me talking about it here might help. Thank you all for the support. The medicine I'm on hasn't helped with the nightmares. They feel so real. I see him. The thing I shot. The thing that killed my brother. It's running through the woods in the dark. It's scared and confused. Last night I dreamed it was in pain. It grabbed a cat that was sleeping in the grass and killed it. I felt the pain of it scratching him. I felt the warm blood as it bit into the cat. It was pregnant, the babies burst like grapes between his teeth. I threw up in my bed. It all felt so real. I had another nightmare, the worst one so far. I saw it in a tool shed, hiding in the dark. It was hiding from the light of the house. There was the sound of running and the screech of metal and a flood of light as something opened the shed door. I felt panic and pain, then it turned to anger. The shape in the door was a boy. When the creature screamed and jumped out, I could feel the boy's panic as well. I felt the creature bite and claw the boy while at the same time feeling the pain of being bitten and clawed. The boy's screams echoed in my mind when I woke up. I haven't slept since then. I've been watching the news for any mention of the creature. Last night I found something. I had to take an extra dose of risperidone to calm down enough to post it. I'll copy the article here. Detroit, WXYZ, a family of 4 was attacked in their home just outside the city limits of Detroit, Michigan. The suspect was apprehended at the scene of the brutal murders and is now in custody. The family consisted of a mother, father, and 2 young children aged 4 and 8. Officers responded to a call about an intruder at a residence near Interstate 75 around 2:47 a.m. Officers and medics found the mother and youngest child had barricaded themselves in the pantry. The father and older child were declared dead at St. John's Hospital about 30 minutes later from severe trauma and bite wounds. The suspect is a man of indeterminate age and ethnicity who was hiding in the shed in the backyard when he attacked a child, 8, and his father who had come outside at hearing his son's screams. The boy and his father suffered scratches and bites from the man who witnesses described as savaging them like a wild animal. He then chased the mother and young son into the home before police arrived to apprehend him. Detectives have been unable to get any information out of the suspect and he refuses to speak at all. They found no identification and so far, fingerprints and DNA have come up inconclusive. The suspect will be held without bail in the Wayne County Jail until more information on his identity is made available. We urge our readers, if you have any information on the identity of the suspect, please contact the Detroit Police Department at 313-974-TIPS. They added a photo of the guy they caught. I almost fainted when I saw it. It's him. Jesus, it's him. Posted by you/drewtheunquestioned. I work for the DNR in the special unit that deals with dangerous cryptids. This is one of the methods we use when someone is attacked by a dogman. I suppose it's about time I told this story. I'm not getting any younger and I think it's a story that needs to be passed on, considering the state of the world. This was in my early days at the DNR, that's the Department of Natural Resources of course, in a unit jokingly called the Night Stalker Unit. It was our job to deal with the cases deemed CZE, that's classified zoological entities. Anything found in the natural world that requires special care and diplomatic contingencies. Dogmen, Sasquatch, merfolk. Any of those entities which defy scientific conventions, display an intelligence similar to our own, or present a formidable threat to our species which requires a high level of discretion and tact on our part. If someone has an encounter with a CZE, that's not something we look into, other than to make sure they haven't gathered any evidence that might compromise the CZE's privacy. What concerns us are the cases of negative contact. If a company is attempting to develop an area which is causing distress to the local CZE population, if one or more hunters have been attempting to catch or kill a CZE, if a family or town has been targeted by one or more CZEs in a dangerous way, or, as was the case I will describe here, someone turned up dead in an apparent attack by a CZE. This case happened in '83, back when I was still a greenhorn working under Connor Duncliffe, my mentor and a legend in the parks and wildlife crowd. We were called out to a park area known as the Land Between the Lakes, over by Kentucky and Tennessee. This was a fairly popular area for hunting, hiking and camping. It was before the big summer rush that a family had parked their RV in the campground located in the northern part of the area to begin what would have been a perfect family summer camping trip. What they got instead was a nightmare beyond anything they thought was possible. The report came to us about 8 hours after a local had found the family dead. By then, The local police and park rangers had gone over the whole terrible scene. The family had been butchered, ripped to shreds by either a wild animal or an axe murderer they didn't know, which is how it ended up on our desk. Connor and I went to the scene and tried to smooth things over with the locals, get them busy with crowd control and patrolling. Anything to minimize the trauma they would experience having to process a scene like this. The campsite looked like the killing floor of a slaughterhouse. The father was laying just outside the door of the camper, split down the middle. The shotgun at his side had only been fired once and based on the evidence hadn't managed to hit anything but dirt. Inside the camper, the little boy was in pieces all around the main living area. He couldn't have been a day over 11. Further in the back we found the mother, in the bathroom at the rear of the camper. The door to the bathroom had been torn off the hinges and crushed like a tin can. We found defensive wounds on her, so she had tried to put up a fight at least. Connor was the one who noticed there were clothes and dolls for a young girl in the camper as well. We searched the area, hoping and praying that she got away and hid somewhere. We found her not 40 yards away, 20 feet up in a pine tree, torn apart and stuck there on a branch the way shrikes will stick bugs on a blackthorn. I had never seen something so terrible before. Connor looked like he was about to faint or lose his lunch. I'd never seen him so mad. After we had both gathered ourselves, we started in on the case. All evidence pointed to a dogman attack, what we called a black dog case at the DNR. The father had been drawn out, most likely by a noise or a tap on the camper. Once he was dispatched, the mother and children barricaded themselves in the bathroom and the CZE tore the door off, killed the mother and proceeded to drag the children out to be slaughtered. Connor was convinced there had been more than one, which meant this wasn't a Rouge loner and meant this was a serious threat to the people in the area. Something had to be done and I had no idea what that might mean. After we made sure the teams had everything under control, we went back to the motel we had rented in the area. I remember Connor spending most of the night on the terrace outside, smoking like a chimney and looking like he was considering something truly unpleasant. The next morning I couldn't be sure he had ever managed to sleep, but he looked at me hard and told me there was a way this could be fixed if I had the courage and was sure I wanted it fixed. I told him I'd do anything to make things right for that family and he nodded with a condemned expression. He told me to go and fetch supplies for a camping trip, for at least 3 or 4 days. We had tents and lights and things like that in the truck, so I got food and water and other necessities. When I got back I saw he had a bag of evidence taken from the scene. When I started to ask about it he just nodded and checked the supplies. We drove further north into Kentucky, deep into the country where the road turned to gravel and gravel to dirt. We seemed to be following an old logging road. When we came to a fence-marked protected land we left the truck and hiked deeper into the woods for most of the day. On the way I noticed Connor picking prairie sage by the handful and stowing it in a bag. We had brought a bow and a few arrows and Connor told me to keep an eye out for any game we could bring down. I spotted a decent-sized jackrabbit and we managed to bag it, even though I wasn't much of a bow hunter. It was nearly night when we reached a spot flat and open enough to set up on. Once camp was set up and he got a fire going, he tossed in a handful of the sage he'd collected. The green leaves created an acrid heavy smoke that permeated the area. It reminded me of my grandmother, who used to burn sage around her house all the time. I asked him if I should clean up the rabbit to make us some food, but he said the rabbit wasn't for us. I had been running through different explanations for what we were out there to do, but nothing made enough sense, so I finally had to ask. Connor looked up at the red-orange fading light and drew in a deep breath. "What we're here to do," he said, "is something we do not do lightly. I haven't done it in going on 20 years now, and I don't suppose I'll ever need to do it again. It was taught to me by my grandfather and his grandfather before him, and before him the Indians who were either taught by their grandfathers or came up with it on their own. You know that the creatures who were responsible for that horror back at the park, they've been around longer than any of us, before the settlers, before the Indians. Our relationship with them has changed throughout our shared history. Sometimes they would have the upper hand and we'd live in fear of the woods, or we'd have the upper hand and they'd be forced back deeper to keep away from our guns and machines. As you know, they are highly intelligent, on a different level than we are, I suppose. I believe they were a sort of evolutionary crossroad where the human race split between the thinking society and the primal tribes. They evolved along a different path, a more natural path you might say. They may not be able to speak our language or build cities like we can, but they are just as sharp, just as observant and adaptive as we are, perhaps even more so, seeing as how they don't have language or histories cluttering up their thinking. The point is, they are not animals in the way wolves or bears are to us. Evolutionarily speaking, they are on the same level as we are, and because of this we have to consider our relationship with them diplomatically. We don't want to live in fear of them, and they want to be left alone. To maintain this peace, The ancient humans had devised a line of contact between us, in the event of some unacceptable event. A way of reaching out and making peaceful contact. Obviously, this is not something either side enjoys in any sense. The dogmen have cultivated a powerful distrust of humans over the centuries, and I can't say I blame them for that. They respect us as a threat, but they despise us as a species. This of course is not true of all of them. Like us, there are some among them more prone to peace and coexistence, just as there are others who would wipe us out given the chance. That is why this contact is extremely risky for us. I remember feeling distant, like what he was saying was bouncing around in my head and I couldn't get a hold of it. Was he seriously telling me we were about to meet with one of the dogmen? A whole pack of them even? For what? To talk to them? Ask for their help? I just sat like a statue as he talked and threw more sage on the fire. The ritual, which is what my granddaddy called it, was to be followed to the letter. The meeting place is deeper into the woods and we were to bring no tools or weapons or even clothes. Nothing but the offering and the evidence. This would put us completely at their mercy, which is the only way they would let us get close. That was the first thing to land in my mind. No weapons? No clothes? I thought he might be trying to kid me, but when I looked at his face I could see he wasn't just serious, he was scared. To see a man like Connor in terror was something I'll never forget. He tossed another clutch of sage on the fire and gestured to it. The sage burning, he said, was part of the ritual. The Indians believed it would ward off evil spirits in the area. My granddaddy had a different idea what it was. He called it an olfactory beacon of sorts. A strong smell to get their attention and one they associate with the contact ritual, letting them know we would be attempting contact. He lifted a branch of the sage to his nose before tossing it into the fire. We waited until the moon was high and the path was lit enough for us to walk in the dark. I was staring up at the moon through my tent wall when Connor called to me and said it was time. I felt my stomach do a gymnastics routine and crawled out to see the fire was out and Connor was already completely bare. I took off my clothes numbly and went to join him. I'd never felt so vulnerable as I did standing in that dark wood, naked and shivering. It wasn't cold, but I imagine I could have been mistaken for a eunuch. I was so nervous. I grabbed the rabbit we'd killed and sort of clutched it to my chest, trying to feel less naked. Before we set out, Connor grabbed a handful of the ashes from the fire and held it out, blowing a puff of soot over me before tossing the rest on himself. We walked and we walked. It seemed like we had walked until I was sure the sun would be coming up. Up until now the forest had been wet with sound. Birds in the trees, bugs chirping and whirring. The whole orchestra of nature. But at some point everything went quiet as a church hall. It was like someone found a volume knob on the woods and turned it off. I hesitated for a moment until I remembered Connor's instructions. Walk steady and calm, keep your eyes on the path. Pay no mind to anything you might see or hear, and most importantly you were not to look at anything if it should look at you. As we walked the only sounds were the wind in the trees and the crunch of leaves beneath us. Until I started to hear something moving in the woods to our left. Something big. I kept my eyes forward as the sound trailed us, matching our pace. Then came a sound to our right, a deep, low, guttural growl that made everything inside you shudder and clench. I had heard the researchers mention infrasound, a sort of low-frequency sound that can cause anxiety and feelings of dread in people. They said it could be detected in a tiger's roar and that our reaction to it might be tied to our ancestral fears. Maybe it wasn't tigers they were worried about after all. Either way, being there in the dark, with nothing between them and us, I can't begin to describe the terror I felt. As we walked, the two at our sides kept abreast of us. One of them jumped onto the path behind us and let out another growl that made my teeth vibrate before charging us. I could hear the crash of the leaves, feel the thuds of its feet hitting the dirt not 2 feet behind me. It took everything within me not to spin around and bolt for the wood line, screaming and pissing myself. I heard it slide to a stop and felt the dirt and sticks it kicked up bounce off my calves, but I just kept walking and Connor did the same. I couldn't feel my body anymore, but I just focused all my sanity on walking and looking straight ahead. When Connor finally stopped, we had come to a clearing. The grass and prairie sage was a bright silver in the moonlight, which was so strong it looked to be daytime. For a moment we just stood. The forest was still and silent as a graveyard. Then I caught a glimpse of eyes reflecting the moonlight in the bushes ahead of us. A large shape emerged from the forest in front of us. It crawled forward on all fours, its black fur seeming to absorb all light. A living silhouette with 2 glowing pearls where its eyes should be. 2 others emerged alongside it like bodyguards. One of them looked like spun silver in the moonlight and its eyes held a spark like amber when you rub it against wool. The other had patches of black and eyes that glowed like the dying cinders of an old bonfire. I almost broke my composure when I felt hot breath on the back of my legs and heard a snuffling. I twitched involuntarily and the thing let out another low warning growl before touching its cold nose to my backside as it sniffed and circled me. Another black shape was circling Connor as well, and I couldn't see his face, but something about his calm demeanor settled a thundering in my ears. The dogman circling me growled again and tried to look up into my eyes, and I looked away quickly, dodging its stare like a nervous kid being confronted by an angry policeman. It lunged at me and I heard the snap of its teeth and felt the rush of air as it bit the air in front of my crotch, sending a shudder through me that made me glad I had emptied my bladder before leaving. The large black dogman eyed us for a moment before shifting. Something inside it popped like a twig being snapped in a wet towel, and it slowly rose onto two legs. The other two followed suit. The two at its sides had to be 7 or 8 feet tall, but the black one had to be closer to 10 feet. I had never seen something so massive so close before. It almost blacked out the moon over us. Connor looked at me and made a gesture to the rabbit I held. I felt like I was in a slow-motion terror dream and my body wouldn't respond. A low growl behind me snapped me out of it and I stepped forward. I could feel the eyes on me like hot pokers held inches from my skin, waiting for an excuse to close the gap. I laid the rabbit at the feet of the largest, stepping into its shadow that seemed to be an extension of itself, as though I might be stepping into a vast open mouth. A snort came from high above me and I felt a snuffling at my hair. To my absolute horror, a nose entered my field of vision, then a muzzle, then the bright bioluminescent pearls of its eyes. Something left me in that moment, like it had reached into me and taken something. What it was I couldn't be sure. I looked away from those points of light in the black mass before me with great difficulty. Then I stepped back, carefully moving to Connor's side once again. The largest sniffed at the rabbit before making a gesture to one of the attendants, who grabbed the hair in one hand. It looked like a gorilla holding a kitten, even though I thought the rabbit had been quite large for its species. It disappeared into the woods and Connor took the bag of evidence from under his arm. He began to pull objects out and laid them on the ground before him. There was a piece of bloodied cloth, a wedding band stained black with blood, a child's shoe, and finally a lock of golden hair. The alpha sniffed at the items intently, growling low as it got to the hair. It stood at its full height and watched Connor as he pulled the last items from the bag. A clutch of fur found in the father's hand, saliva samples taken from the bodies, and small vial of urine-soaked dirt taken near the site. The alpha sniffed at these items and snorted before grunting and standing. It growled deeply for a moment before turning to disappear into the dark with a brief step, covering the distance to the trees like a cloud passing in front of the moon. The others soon followed, looking back at us with low warning growls. After they had gone, Connor and I just stood in shock until the sounds of the forest returned as quickly as they had gone. A great weight seemed to lift off me and I felt like I might pass out. Connor took a long breath in and let it out slow, shaking just the smallest bit. He looked at me and grinned. "I think she likes you," he said, and I almost fell over at that, my knees buckling slightly. The trip back to the camp seemed to happen in double time, like someone rewinding a tape. Once we found the lanterns, Connor and I pulled on our clothes and climbed into our tents without a word. I felt like I might never sleep again, my heart still thudding in my ears, but I ended up falling asleep almost as soon as my head hit the pillow. The next few days were spent camping and waiting. Connor had told me we had to stay in the area until we had gotten some indication that they had done something about our mutual problem. He told me about his first time performing the ritual of contact. It hadn't been here, though he said he had contacted this pack before. This was apparently something done all over the country. The ritual changes slightly in certain areas, but the purpose was the same. On the third night we heard far-off howling, deep and piercing even at a distance. It sounded the way a coyote pack will sing in chorus, all baying and howling and yipping at different volumes and intervals. The next morning we found, laid on the ground before our campfire, 3 massive clawed hands severed at the wrist and lined up. Connor smiled when he saw it. "Looks like they took care of it," he'd said, lifting one to examine it. He handed one to me and it felt heavier than it looked, like holding a gun for the first time. The one hand was bigger than both my hands together and the long claws at the end of each finger had to be 5 inches and retracted slightly. The fur on each was a different color and each one was clearly a left hand. Connor dropped each into a separate bag and said the lab boys would be over the moon about these. They tended to collect their dead fairly religiously, so remains are difficult to come by. And then we packed up and went. We hadn't heard of any further activity in the area and we told everyone we were authorized to tell that the situation was resolved and we had performed a highly successful contact. After that I felt a bit like a celebrity at the DNR. It was something I'll never forget and something I wouldn't considering doing again unless the situation was dire. Although, with the reports we've been getting lately, it might be something we won't be able to do at all anymore very soon. We don't know why they've been becoming more active and aggressive lately, but it certainly makes the continued peace between us more and more unreliable. What that means for the future, I can only fear the worst. Posted by you/drewtheunquestioned. For my son. I am writing this, I guess, to explain why I did what I did. Why I wasn't around. Not many dads get the chance to do this, though every deadbeat dad I've ever known had wanted to, with all of what was left of their dried up hearts. I'm telling you this because my own dad got the chance to explain to me why he left the way he did. Of course his circumstances were different than mine are now, and I know it meant a lot to hear him explain. So here it is, son. My written confession. Told to you so you know why you can't ever see me again. So you'll know why you have to promise never to come looking for me. I suppose I should begin with my own dad leaving. I was 2 weeks from 6 years old. I remember because I didn't get a party that year because of everything that happened. She didn't tell me about the night he left until I was already in college. I guess by then time had scabbed over her hard enough to talk about it with me, but even then she could hardly get through it without breaking down. I had brought a flu home from school the week before and it was making its rounds through the family. By the time I had gotten over it, my dad was in the home stretch and my mom was just getting to the really rough part. I had a baby sister then and she seemed to avoid the flu altogether, which my mother thanked the Lord God in heaven for every time she came back from puking her guts out. The night my dad left, my mom was passed out in bed with a 100-degree fever and I was already asleep. My dad was left to take care of my new baby sister, which, while awkward, wasn't beyond his abilities. Maybe it was because he was still getting over that flu, or that he had taken a couple beers to relax. My mother didn't know for sure, but at some point my baby sister must have woken up crying and somewhere in the hurry and confusion my dad dropped her, or she rolled off her changing table, or something. She landed badly and died before my dad knew what had happened. I never told my mom this, but I remember the exact moment my baby sister died. I remember because I woke up from a dead sleep like someone had shouted in my ear. It was the silence that brought me awake. That terrible, loaded silence that comes after something irrevocable happens. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I still had a hard time getting back to sleep. The next thing I remember was being woken up by screaming. My mother had come into my sister's room to find her swaddled and silent on her changing table, which was odd. She had that fleeting moment of paranoia every parent has when their baby is fast asleep, watching for signs of breathing or subtle movement. But when she touched her face and it was cold and still, her fears went electric in her brain. Somewhere in all the screaming and shaking she managed to call my aunt and she and my uncle came over, my uncle taking me back to his house while my aunt stayed with my mom. My dad was gone. It was like he had evaporated, nothing was taken, no note, nothing. After the autopsy confirmed cause of death had been blunt force trauma, most likely from a fall, my mother pieced together what had happened. She never filed a missing person report or made any attempt to find him. She told me she wanted to many times, but each time she would start considering it, a coldness came over her. It wasn't hate or resentment, though that was never far from her thoughts of my father. It was subconscious certainty that my father didn't want to be found. For fear or shame she wasn't sure. She didn't expect to see him ever again. Until 26 years later when he called her out of the blue. After the shock and disbelief wore off, they talked until she invited him to dine at the old house. She called me to tell me about it afterward. We ended up talking most of the night and there was crying and swearing, but in the end we both came to terms with the idea. The moment felt unreal to me, like when you have a bad fall and you can't tell how bad you're hurt until you see your arm turn the wrong way, but even then it seems unreal. I wasn't sure if I was supposed to be feeling anything about seeing my dad again, or if I even would after it was all said and done. My memories of my father were only what I saw in pictures. He was stocky, pale, and had a clean, natural smile made by a healthy sense of humor. When I saw my father in person for the first time, my first thought was that he was an imposter. The man at the door was gaunt and lanky. His eyes were sunken and his face, though clean-shaven possibly for the first time in many years, was tanned and battered like jerked meat. His exposed skin was a network of scars, hard and dry as wood. I thought maybe I would recognize him when he smiled, but when he did it was a hollow, sad smile, like someone looking at an old photograph of someone they'd loved but who wasn't around anymore. We ate awkwardly, making small talk, all of us waiting for the real talk to start like kids counting the miles before the thunder rolls in. After he broke the ice, time seemed to move at a fevered pace to catch up. Hours flew by, questions were asked, stories told, tears shed. I started to feel the anger and pain about his absence in my life, but all my empathy and attention was focused on my mother. Maybe I just used her as a basis for my own feelings, reacting to her reactions so I wouldn't have to fabricate my own. I only resented him if she did, I would only forgive him if she forgave him. Maybe that sounds strange, even a bit cowardly, but I was never able to process emotions in the moment. I have to think about it, let it settle in my mind before I can feel any way about anything. Sometimes it makes me seem stoic and logical, other times I come off as cold or unfeeling. In any case, I was the one who brought up the subject of my baby sister. He told us he had dropped my little sister that night and the shock and terror had eclipsed his mind. When he regained his senses, he was on a street corner miles from home. He wanted to go back, but the shame and guilt had crushed him. He couldn't go back, not after running away like that, not after what he'd done. He screamed into the cold night sky like a man possessed until he heard sirens and began to run. He had been living on the streets ever since, moving from town to town. Drifting, as some would call it. He endured harsh nights and long days, suffering the indignities and dangers with the resignation of the condemned. In his weaker moments he'd considered suicide, but each time his shame pushed him on. He knew he hadn't suffered enough for what he'd done. When I'd asked him why he came back, what convinced him to contact us again, I saw a shadow pass over his eyes for a brief moment and he said nothing until he noticed us waiting and stammered out something about feeling the time was right. My mother and I both knew this wasn't the truth, but I think I was the only one unnerved by it. We said our goodbyes around 2 a.m. and I told him I worked overnight so I wasn't really tired, and he offered to buy me coffee at an all-night dinner so we could talk some more. There was a cold and bitter wind that night that promised ice and possibly snow the next day. As we walked across the parking lot, I noticed a figure hunched over across the street under a dim, orange street light. It looked like a typical rag man from old books, covered in scraps and loose cloth from head to toe. I thought I saw a glint coming from the sunken holes of its eyes when my father saw I was staring at something and looked over. All the color ran out of his face like one of those color-changing cars that went from green to yellow when you got them wet, and he froze. When I touched his arm, it felt like a high-tension wire and he seemed to wrench himself away from it and turn toward the dinner. I looked back and the rag man was gone. After we got our coffee and he had taken a few sips, my father seemed to relax enough to speak. This is hard for me to talk about. You may think I'm crazy before it's all done, but I need to tell you. I thought I could let it be over with, but now. He swallowed hard, like he did something in his throat, and took another sip. Now you need to know. I took the only sip of my coffee I would that night and asked him, "Are you talking about why you came back? The real reason?" He closed his eyes and nodded, taking a quick look out the window of the dinner. The place was silent this late. Radio music drifted faintly from the kitchen and back, along with the clinks and thumps of dishwashing. It felt like we were sitting in a diving bell, settling at the bottom of an undersea chasm. Silent lights and movements outside the glass that felt alien and disturbing, the darkness heavy and black as old motor oil. My father stared into his coffee cup like a round black mirror and told me about his life before he came here. Living out there on the streets as long as I have, you start to feel like somewhere along the way you step through an invisible curtain that separates the world of the living from the land of the dead. You become transparent and inscrutable to the normal people moving around and making their lives. It's the way ghosts must feel. Seeing everything while being unseen. You see people do and say things they would never do or say around a living soul. Many of them cruel, some funny, but still others were blackly depressing. I've been attacked, derided, spit on, propositioned, raped, stabbed, imprisoned. You name it, I've seen it done to me or someone else. You learn you need friends over there, on the other side. One of the best I ever knew was a man called himself Bear. A huge mountain of a man who'd never known the touch of a razor or a bar of soap. The smell of him could peel the varnish off an end table, but his eyes were bright and his smile seemed to shine out of his dangled beard like the sun through a thick canopy of branches. He said the craziest things and knew they were crazy, but he liked to make people laugh. He'd been on the street since he was a boy of 10 and showed me more than a few tricks he'd picked up over the years. I met him down south on a boxcar and we drifted together for the better part of a year before we came to the place where the tracks ended and Mexico began. After we jumped the car, we walked along the tracks until we spotted a building a ways from the road. It was long since abandoned and the sign was cracked and nearly illegible. The only word I could make out was slaughter, though the S was worn away so it looked like it said laughter. I guessed it was an old slaughterhouse. Bear asked if we should look inside, but I said no without even thinking. There was something off about the place. The world on the streets was a world of superstitions and talismans, curses, and taboos. Like the old days before the light of reason and science illuminated the world, you lived according to invisible forces beyond your control or understanding. I told him it gave me the creeps and he didn't argue the point. We found the shanty town beneath an old bridge just down the hill the old slaughterhouse sat on. There were a half-dozen hobos living there and they seemed accommodating enough. It was getting on toward winter and we needed to settle somewhere until the farm jobs came back for the spring. We made ourselves useful, gathering wood for the fire, bringing food from the charities in the town just past the rails, and of course lending a sympathetic ear to anyone who needed it while telling our own tales of windfalls and setbacks. Bear was the one who brought up the subject of the slaughterhouse to the others around the fire one night. The others knew to steer clear of that place. It was full of rusty tools and jagged metal that could slice through a rubber sole like butter, not to mention the diseases from all the old blood and abandoned offal. The smell of that place was enough to keep even the most desperate hobo away, except one. My father took another sip and looked like a man about to pick up a load that might be too heavy for him. "One?" I asked, deciding I should say something if only to remind myself I was still there. Meade was what they called the only hobo they'd seen come and go from that place. He never came over to their encampment, not even to share the fire. No one ever talked to him and no one wanted to talk about him if they could help it. He was strange, even among a world of strangers like ours. They called him Meat, both because of his place of residence and because he smelled even worse than the killing floor he slept on. Everyone knows life on the street was no bed of roses, so for someone to smell bad enough to be offensive to even their sensibilities, you could only imagine what filth he lived in. He never spoke a word, but a few could have sworn they heard yips and howls from that old place, the kind of things you'd hear in a psych ward on a full moon. Sometime during that long winter, Bear started to keep to himself more and more. He never seemed to smile anymore and rarely spoke. I thought he might have caught a fever and I went to ask him, but when I found him he was crying. I asked him what was wrong and he told me. He said one night about a week ago he'd heard sounds from that old slaughterhouse. He ignored it and they went away until he heard a shuffling noise nearby, like someone dragging something through the leaves. The smell was what drove him out of bed. He said it was the worst thing he'd ever smelled. When he looked he saw Meat, just a massive black mound of rags and hair, dragging what looked like a store mannequin, white as bone and missing a leg. Then it stopped and looked at him. He felt his guts tighten and his chest seize so he couldn't breathe. Bear said he could see two little points of light, like an animal's eyes when the light hits it, somewhere deep within the eyeless caves of its sockets. When Bear finally pulled away from that gaze he heard a cry like some guttural animal yowl and more sounds of movement. He never slept that night and not any night since. He told me he would smell that awful smell sometimes at night, hear sounds like voices or animal calls, like someone trying to get his attention. He knew it was coming for him. The smell followed him everywhere now so he couldn't eat. I could see terror in his eyes and a hopelessness like a man before the gallows. Then one morning he was gone. I'd asked around to see if he'd said anything or if anyone saw him go, but only a few said they'd seen him. They all said he'd gotten up in the night and just walked out into the dark toward the slaughterhouse. They said he looked wide awake and calm but didn't say a word to any of them. I couldn't believe he'd go to that place after what he described to me, so I thought he must have left town to get away from it. A few days later some of the others claimed they saw him near the fire that night, just standing there and smelling like the ruptured bowls of the devil himself. I didn't know what to think. Maybe he'd come back and just hadn't said anything to me, or maybe he'd gotten to know whoever was living in that old building and was staying there. I kicked it around and around until I'd convinced myself I had to check the place out myself. If Bear was in trouble, I had to find out. I went at midday. Nothing could have convinced me to approach the place at night. There were little windows at the base that must have led to a basement, and I could see a clear path to and from one of the larger broken panes that must have been where Meat came and went. I looked down into it, but the darkness was as solid as cloth inside, and I went to the front entrance instead. The doors were rusted off the hinges and a solid metal chain held them to the center frame where they hung like angel wings. Inside was bright and open, the roof having decayed and crumbled over the years. They were huge rusting hunks of machinery and old meat hooks on long resting poles. The stench of the place was overpowering. It wasn't just a bad smell, I'd experienced my share of those in the back alleys of the world. It was a wrong smell. Like some alien miasma that could drive you mad. Like an impossible shape that strained your eyes to look at and made you feel seasick. I had to hold my shirt over my mouth to go any further. That was when I noticed it. Everything was quiet. There wasn't a single bug chirping or bird calling. Even the wind had stopped. I felt my chest tighten as I realized I now stood before an open cellar door. The corroded stairs went down into that eerily solid darkness, and all I could see at the bottom was a mass of fur and garbage with bright white bones jutting out of it and what looked like old sausage links bleached white and dry. I recognized the shape of what had once been a dog before the smell became so overwhelming I turned and ran, but not before hearing what sounded like clattering bones and someone clacking their teeth together down there. As I ran, my mind was finally able to process that the sausages scattered around down there hadn't been sausages at all. They were fingers. His hand had begun to tremble slightly and he finished off his coffee with a grimace. I got the waitress' attention and she topped him off while we sat and let his story sink in. After the waitress was gone and the steam from the coffee started to dissipate, he continued. That night I lay awake in my makeshift tent for what seemed like forever. I couldn't get the image of those fingers scattered around the dead dog out of my head, or the sounds that came out of that dark hole. Sometime in the night the sounds started from the slaughterhouse. Sounds like a man possessed with demons. Howls and shouts, animal yowls and cries. They faded and grew louder like music down a windy street. Then came the smell. It was like the smell of that place but worse, if that were possible. It made me think of squirming maggots in medical waste or bodies dissolving in pits of lye. God, the things that came to mind were worse than any nightmares. I started to hear shuffling steps outside and something like a pebble ticked against the side of my tent. A few more came and I just turned away, pretending to sleep, my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears like a low roar. It was quiet a long time, and that was worse I think, waiting for it to make its move. When the sky finally went from bruised purple to baby blue I crawled out and stared up at the rising sun with relief, until I looked down and saw the tracks circling my tent and a pile of small bones arranged in a strange shape on the ground in front of the door. I asked the others if they heard sounds from the old slaughterhouse that night but no one had heard anything, or at least they said they didn't. I could tell they were spooked by something. I didn't sleep anymore. The sounds came every night, sometimes faint and distant, other times it must have been right outside the tent walls. They started to sound like voices. People shouting my name or just calling sharply. A couple times it sounded almost like your mother's voice. Maybe I was half dreaming or half crazy but it sounded like I remembered her. I found more bones and totems around my tent and the smell would come even in the daytime. I started staying up at the communal fire all night just to be near the light. That was when I saw Bear for the last time. I was watching the flames dance around the logs and branches when I heard a man call sharply behind me. I turned to look without thinking and I saw him there, just beyond the fire's light. He stood swaying like he was dead drunk and just stared at me. I knew it was him by the beard and the clothes but his face looked slack and pale. His eyes were like little caves and inside I could see the shine of eyes like an animal's catching the light. That was when I knew Bear was dead and that meat, or whatever he was, had killed him and had taken his skin like a suit to camouflage itself. I grabbed a branch from the fire and threw it at him. The thing darted away as fast and silent as a shadow. I heard more shouts and cries from the dark that night but I just focused on the fire and tried to block them out. Morning seemed to come suddenly, like it had been held back until that moment, or maybe I'd nodded off without realizing. I heard people talking and saw several people looking at my tent, or what was left of it. The whole thing had been torn to shreds and my stuff was thrown around like an animal had been rooting through it for food. The smell was everywhere and even the others noticed it. They all looked at me gravely, some with pity, others with fear. I knew I had to leave the shanty. There was a shelter in town I knew. Shelters weren't the best place to stay in most cases. You could be robbed, beaten or worse. At least on the streets you could hide yourself or find a place away from others. This time I had worse things to worry about than other people. They gave me a cot and blanket and I tried to sleep for the first time in days. I woke up to the smell and people standing around my bed looking down at me. I had been shouting and thrashing in my sleep. The next night something grabbed my shoulder and woke me up. I was standing at the fire exit with one hand on the door and the night watchman asking me what I was doing. I had never sleepwalked before. I was terrified. I tried to stay up and just watch the moon through the window but I heard the voice again, the one like your mother's, and I felt a cold breeze. The moon was bright and filled the shelter like someone had torn the roof off. After a moment I realized I was standing outside. I panicked and tried to orient myself and that was when I noticed the familiar silhouette of the slaughterhouse in the moonlight. Christ, I had walked almost all the way there in my sleep. I ran back to the shelter in a blur of terror and exhaustion. I asked the shelter folks if they had a locked room I could sleep in. They said something about regulations and policies and basically told me to be glad for the bed they gave me or go back to the streets. My father looked like a man ready to faint or puke or maybe both. He shook his head and took a deep breath. That was my last night in that town. If the shelter wouldn't keep me safe I thought the cops might. I went to the small police station and asked if they could put me in a holding cell for the night. They told me to go to the shelter and generally treated me like they would a bug who had crawled across their desk. Desperation pushing me on, I grabbed a passing officer who had been glaring at me since I came in and stunned him with a headbutt and grabbed his service pistol. The station exploded into action and I just shielded my face as they threw me to the ground and dragged me to the cells in the back. I watched the light outside fade as they read me the riot act and left me to my cell. When the lights shut off, I sat on the cot and watched the moon through the window. Even though I knew I was safe here, some part of me refused to believe it. I thought I had been able to stay awake, but I must have fallen asleep at some point because it got bright without me realizing it. I thought it was the morning light, but it was the moon was shining down through the roof of the holding cell like it had in the shelter, only this time I could see the holes and support beams silhouetted there. I could see huge rusting machines blood black in the moonlight and slowly realized where I was. In front of me was the cellar door, those stairs leading down to that blackness somehow even blacker than the night above. The screams and howls began and grew all around me until I thought it might burst my ears. All the blood seemed to run out of me and my heart was pounding like a desperate bellows worker to keep me going. The smell was wafting up from that hole and I could feel it on my skin, curling my little hairs like flames. I felt my sanity stretch to the breaking point like a guitar string tuned 3 octaves above its limits. The sounds, that place, the smell. I couldn't take it. I started to fade then, to diminish. But there came a different sound. A baby's crying. God in heaven, it was the cries of my little girl. My heart started up again in that moment and my legs moved like a marionette puppet, moving on their own and pulling me away from that cellar door that lay open like a great toothless mouth. I was running then, running like a toddler who'd only just learned it could. The sounds grew more manic, but I could hear the distance diminishing them. When I came to the train yard, I was shaking all over and was sure my heart would give out at any moment. I climbed into a boxcar and fainted dead away. I woke up in another town with the train conductor shouting for me to get lost. I found a shelter and they gave me clothes and food. I thought about what had happened in a kind of daze. It seemed like a nightmare. It was impossible. I thought about what I'd heard, the sound that snapped me out of whatever spell I'd been under, and I thought about you and your mother for the first time in years. I decided right then I had to face you. Something about going through a nightmare like that made the fear and shame I'd felt about facing you seem childish. I went to a church and they gave me a bus ticket here and enough for a phone call. He smiled at me then, but it was that empty, sad smile again, like someone who'd come to terms with the inevitable. "What are you gonna do now?" I asked, knowing the answer was already written in his eyes. "I thought I could come here and make a new start, you know? Get to know you maybe and your mother if she'd let me. Just make a life here, but I just don't." Tears were filling his eyes, making them shiny and red, and his voice broke as he spoke. "God, I don't think I can. Son. I think it followed me. I saw it. It wants me, son. I don't think I can get away from it now." He reached out and snatched my hand, gripping it desperately like a man about to tumble over a cliff. "I love you, son. I want you to know that now. I never stopped loving you, even when it hurt so bad I wished I couldn't anymore. And your mother too, and especially your little sister, God keep her." He shuddered and sniffed. I watched the tears roll down to the tip of his nose and hang there, bright under the fluorescent lights of the dinner. I didn't know if his story was true, but I had to do something. When I told him he could stay with me, maybe call the police, he looked up sharply, terrified. "No. I can't do that. It would follow me there too, and it might take you or your family. You have to promise me, right now. Promise you won't come looking for me after I leave here tonight. If God has any mercy, it'll follow me away from this place and you'll never see me again. Please, son, promise." I promised him, and he finished his coffee and we said our goodbyes. I only saw him once since that night in the dinner. I was at my overnight job at the warehouse taking a break at the smoking table out back when I heard him call my name. I looked out into the dull orange darkness and saw him standing just beyond a street lamp across the alley. He looked haggard and his face was slack, swaying like there was a high wind even though the air was mostly still that night. Something glinted in the sunken caverns of his eyes and he began to shudder like he was laughing, but no sound came out. I remembered thinking the dumpsters back there smelled even worse than before that night. After that I started hearing the noises at night, like the ones my dad described. Christ, it sounds like a mental patient imitating animal calls. The smell is more terrible than anything I thought possible. The dreams are worse though. They are so vivid and real. I've started waking up in different rooms in the house I don't remember going to sleep in. Last night I woke up in the backyard. My dog went missing the night before. I find little totems around the house, made from rotten bones and hair tied together with what looked like rawhide strips. I don't know, I try not to touch them. They smell awful, even after I scrap them into a dustpan and throw them in the trash. One of them had my dog's collar tag attached to it. I try not to think about where the bones and hair came from. Sometimes I'll hear it crashing around my house when I've barricaded myself in my room for the night. I hear sounds like voices that sound like you or your mother, calling for me. That's the worst. If my paranoia would allow it, I'd plug my ears, but I can't risk dulling any of my senses. I don't know what to do anymore. The cops come around sometimes after I called them, but of course they don't see anything. I think they've written me off as crazy. I might be soon enough. That's why I gave your mother full custody. I'm leaving town today and I won't be back. I don't know where I'm going, just away from here. Please don't think I'm crazy. Please know I love you. And please promise you won't look for me. If you see me again and I look strange or won't come into the light, or if you hear me call out to you from the dark, you run to your mother and you tell her to leave right then. Please promise me, son. I love you, and I'm sorry.